Hello, welcome to another episode of Test, Optimize, and Scale. Very excited to have Evan Pondel here with us today, founder and CEO of TriUnfo Partners. Evan, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Jason. Pleasure to be here.
Absolutely. I've been enjoying a lot of our collaboration discussions. Thought we'd bring some of this to this forum for listeners. As mentioned, a lot of founders tune in here, and I think these details can be very helpful towards their campaigns. Why don't we start with your story? You want to familiarize the listeners a bit with yourself and everything you guys do in terms of IR, communications, and PR?
Sure. So I guess my story really begins in childhood. And I always loved storytelling. Yeah, when I was a kid, even. And I was involved in theater. I actually was an amateur ventriloquist when I was a kid. I had
Wow.
3 or 4 dolls. Might sound a little strange to some, but the idea of bringing this entity to life by storytelling was always appealing to me for whatever reason. And so that kind of began my interest and journey in this whole storytelling world that we live in. And in college, I got into the student newspaper. I got real deep into it. In fact, I spent more time at the student newspaper than I did in my classes. But just I loved it. I loved telling stories. I loved publishing in a newspaper. At the time, we were still a print edition, and became the political editor. And I was thinking, okay, what am I going to do after college? And I had all these clips, but I was like, journalism, man. There's no money in it. It's almost like wanting to be an actor almost, it feels like, because it's like, how are you going to make a living? How are you going to be successful? And I was lucky enough to get an internship out of college in Washington, D.C. at a publication called Roll Call, which is on the Hill there. And then from there, I got a job at Dow Jones for the Wallstreet Journal in New York. And that really was kind of where I got my formal training in business writing and business storytelling. And I had an editor who was rather, just going to say the word, I don't know if your audience can handle it, but I'm just going to call him a hard ass. I was working a lobster shift real early in the morning, had to be out the door by 4:30 and at my desk by 5. And I was covering Asian markets and European markets. And if I didn't get something right, he would literally ball up a piece of paper and throw it at my head.
Nice.
And it really just, eventually it became funny. I'd bat it away, and we had good rapport over the years. But that was where I kind of got my fundamental, exposure to business writing. And then 10 years into journalism and working for various publications, I just didn't really know where my career was headed. I had goals, right? I wanted to own a house. I wanted to have a family and all these things. And I didn't really know how I was going to be able to support those things with the salary I was making at the time. So a natural trajectory for many journalists is to go into PR. And some call it the dark side, because now you're representing the companies that you were writing about and holding accountable.
Right.
And my dad actually was in public relations. And so I always maybe had a slightly different perspective, just because, he was my first editor, and he always taught me to respect both sides. And so I had an opportunity to work for a company I wrote about, to be their in-house director of communications. And it was a tech company. And I don't know. It sounded appealing, but going in-house somewhere at the time just felt like, wow, I'm really going from writing about all these different types of stories and parachuting into a lot of different things to now being like one track. So instead, I joined an agency that was specializing in IR and PR. And I brought that company that wanted to hire me over as a client, and thus began my journey career in investor relations. And investor relations, public relations, they're very similar in that they're in the same universe. We're telling stories to a specific audience, and you know PR, you're telling stories to media, you're telling stories to customers, employees, maybe other companies. In IR, your primary audience are investors. So and those investors range in different shapes and sizes, from institutional investors like BlackRock to individual investors like you and me. And so that's really kind of the genesis, if you will, of my journey to IR and PR, and where I'm at today, essentially.
Sure. And I know you've worked with some of the top brands in this space. We've had some overlap with clients on Reg A Plus campaigns and this whole new frontier of digital investment opportunities, as you're mentioning, both for accredited and retail, both for the institutional and the individual investors, and being able to talk to both sides. I love how you began with the story, not just your story, but being able to craft a story. How you were doing this in the school newspaper and through roll call and onwards to the Wall Street Journal and other endeavors from there, and all the way up to Triumphal Partners. I'd like to talk more about that. Maybe we can unravel a bit. How does one build a story? I know there's a beginning, middle, and end. I'm always looking to train my team on this, whether it's account managers, business development team professionals, definitely my content marketing team. How do you go about creating a story?
Yeah. So at the Wall Street Journal, if you look at the newspaper, on one of the columns at the top, it says, "What's news?" And that is a question that you always have to ask yourself when you're approaching a story. What's going on here? Is there something that we need to tell people? News doesn't create itself. Someone has to actually say, that's news. And so really identifying what the story is and what's news, that's really at the core. I had an editor at the LA Daily News that literally would say, "Go, get out of the newsroom, get out of here." And I'd be like, "What do you mean, Dan?" He's like, get the hell out of here." I'm like, "Do you want me to go home?" I'm like, "You want me to go get sandwiches for everyone? What do you want me to do?" And he'd say, "No, go find me a story." And I'd literally be driving around the San Fernando Valley with like no idea what I was going to do. And I would literally look for interesting businesses, people on the street, hospitals, anything. And I'd have to come back that afternoon, and I'd have 2 hours to write. They measured stories back then, when newspapers, in like inches. So like how long the column ran in inches on the actual newspaper. So he'd be like, "Give me a 20-inch story," which is probably 300 to 500 words or something like that.
Okay.
And I would just figure something out, but it had to have a news element. Like, why are you writing about it? Is the company in the middle of a Series A, a Series B? Are they launching a product? Is there a new CEO?
Yep.
There's got to be some sort of news element that is at the core of like the reason why, the thesis as to why you're writing this story.
And what I like to point out for, let's say, equity crowdfunding or various early stage investment opportunities is, what is this company doing that is new? What's different? What's reflecting other current events and headlines that the target audience may be consuming on a day-to-day basis. I imagine those are some key elements of what you want to be able to highlight. Do you have a format that you work off of, some type of algorithm of, hey, here's how I like to splinter it all in? I recall my writing days. I'm not a professional writer by trade, but I think there was like a Jane Schaefer format, beginning, opening for each element of it. Is it safe to say that those elements do not apply to this type of story writing? Is there any infrastructure that a founder can work off of to formulate those ideas?
Yes, there is. And I've worked with early stage companies. I've worked with later stage publicly traded companies. And the formula really comes down to the investor thesis.
Investor
And
thesis.
usually there's five. The investor thesis, yeah, that's core to this narrative. You need to come up with an investor thesis, and that consists of the proof points as to like what we were just talking about, like why now, why people want to look at what you're doing now. And if you're creating a new kind of like solar technology, that's part of your investor thesis. Like the thinnest, panel that exists, the most energy generated from, this square inch of panel. And then maybe that's one point on the investor thesis. Next point, no debt. Okay. Next point, raised, 5 million, 10 million, 100 million, 200 million in the last 2 quarters. Next point. And then CEO, has patents on XYZ, blah, blah, blah. So now you have these proof points, right? And then you're going to now add some meat and flesh that out in a presentation or a white paper or a quarterly conference call or whatever it is. But I really feel like having kind of setting yourself up to win with that investor thesis, that's the algorithm that we're talking about. That's key to presenting a narrative. And I think also if you put that at the top, just like you were saying, in high school, there was like a statement of organization. You had your thesis, and then you had your statement of organization, which is how you're going to lay out your. I mean, it's unbelievable how that stuff still applies.
It
It
does.
it gives the audience something to hold on to. You're giving them a
Yep.
roadmap, right? And especially when you're dealing with money and asking for money, you want to hold people's their hands while you're taking them down this journey. So I really think it's important to establish those proof points at the top and then commence your narrative, how these things all apply to each other, and then tie it up at the end. Repeat your investor thesis at the end.
Yes.
I just took you through this. Again, this is what I proved, and I'm either irresistible or you're going to pass.
It's amazing how those simple structures can really lead to strong organization. I think the format I was referring to, there was an opening paragraph, closing paragraph, 3 bodies, intro sentence, closing sentence to the bodies, and then a concrete detail with 2 commentaries for each. I remember my early days at an agency, I was working on strategies and they asked me to hop in and write an article, and I used this format. They were blown away. Wow, this really reads well. I really just thought into a format. So I love what you're saying here
Yeah,
and bringing the thesis back at the end. I imagine that's why you're getting strong responses from publishers. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But I really do believe it all comes down to that story and finding those moments where I use a lot of offline, online comparisons. If you were speaking to an investor offline, what moments would their eyes kind of open up a little bit more? How can those be bulleted out, put into the thesis, packaged, and then set up for distribution? How long does it take to come up with this storyline? How much do you dedicate to the initial timeline for putting some of these assets together before you take it out to third parties?
sure. So it's usually the first thing I do when I get engaged with a company is like I create a messaging document, and it essentially is kind of the boilerplate of the company. like what it is, what it does. And it's the four W's and an H. Here's another formula.
I like
You
it.
know, who, what, when, where. Okay. So you got to answer all those questions. Who is this company? What is it? When, why, and then where are you doing it? And then the last element to that is how. And so if you can answer all of those questions as you're creating this messaging document, then after that, all kind of roads lead back to that messaging document when you're presenting your narrative. And it's really core for me, at least, just in terms of just consistency of message across platforms. And I also think for executives, it's nice to have that narrative kind of crystallized there, and it'll obviously change, right? Companies evolve, but I feel like that's kind of like the part of the Bible, if you will, that you start with when you're crafting a company's narrative, and then having to execute with different tactics to reach these key audiences.
And this may sound basic to some listeners, who, what, where, when, how. You wouldn't believe how many founders, at least that I've come across when working in public-private markets, that these are missings. It's more of a concern of when am I getting the capital, how long, when any of these fundamentals being out of place can be the difference from a callback on a publisher inquiry to not getting any third parties or any of meaning for that matter to cover you. So I think it all really comes down to this when I've seen what gets picked up and what does not.
Yeah, I think CEOs are moving at warp speed, right? And they're trying to raise money and do everything they can. And I think it's easy to just kind of write this off as like, okay, just give me like 5 sentences, Evan, on who we are and what we do. But this is actually critical in my opinion. I mean, it's what I do, so I'm obviously biased, but I really do feel that as someone that's been on the receiving end of these stories as a journalist, if your story is half baked, then it's going to not translate as well among a lot of constituents, including investors who are helping fund your company. So it's key. This is a key exercise to me, and one that I really think should get prioritized. When you're engaging with a communication specialist.
Or you get those rolled up pieces of paper thrown at you, right? Like,
yeah, I mean, I actually now throw them at CEOs when they don't want to do this. So
picked it up from your father, taking
yeah,
it there.
I'm just like, all right, man, like I know it's not going to hurt, but I want it to be impactful. So here, I'm going to ball up this piece of notebook paper and I'm going to throw it at you, and you're going to tell me how it feels.
Sure. And I think everyone needs that hard ass editor as well too. I believe as you had a Wall Street Journal,
Yeah.
that really what shapes things. So when we're looking at launching with an issue or a group that is preparing for a capital raise using these marketing channels, using these filings, we try to make sure everything's in place here. We're not skipping steps. We're not in a race to the funding as much as a good foundation that will be able to convert prospective investors and at scale.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, just seeing the quality work that you do, Jason, it's one of those things that if you launch too quickly, you're going to run out of runway, that much more quickly too, right? And it applies to, I think, quality marketing and quality writing and quality storytelling. You really want to have a great foundation so that there's a longer tail to this narrative, as opposed to just kind of, a quarter or two of excitement,
Exactly. And it's going to be a journey for the prospective investor. I like putting that perspective on it, but it's 7 touch points or more. What are they going to see all the way through? Who's talking about you is a big part of it. I quote the book Sapiens, where they say, and I think they actually pull it from somewhere else, the more times an individual hears a piece of information from the more sources, the more likely they are to believe it. So if you have a list of third parties that are reputable talking about an investment opportunity as being, favorable, at some point it's going to resonate. It's almost going to become that reader's narrative. So I know for us, we're always encouraging issuers to do an element of this. We create some content in house. We're by no means a PR group or have the type of relationships or infrastructure for PR. So would like to ask the broad question as an opener: how does one get picked up by the press, by the media? How do they go about it? I know we've talked about different tiers and different avenues to go down and get covered by those publishers, some being paid, some being organic. How does it all happen? How do you get featured?
Yeah. So um, earned media, which is getting a bona fide reporter to write about you, is really hard, um, because you're dealing with an industry that is on a really tight budget and historically doesn't have enough people to cover all the stories that are out there, even the great ones, right? And so that's the challenge. Like, how do you get a reporter's attention, and and not do it in a way that's going to be like annoying? Because I think a lot of PR people are shy about pitching because they don't want to come across as annoying to the people they're pitching. And I will tell you, the one way to get around that is by presenting a highly interesting quality story. Okay. And it sounds again, it's one of those simple things. Um, but I'm proud of the stories that I pitch, because I know that as a reporter, if I were to receive this pitch, I would want to write about it. And that's how I approach every every story, every pitch I write. Now, the actual mechanics. So once you've got that story, that's, to me, again, it's a question of whether it's irresistible. Attorneys have beyond reasonable doubt. PRIR folks, is this an irresistible nugget? Like, I just can't. I have to eat it. It's got the dark chocolate. It's got all the elements that I'm looking for, right? And so once you've got that pitch, it's like, okay, now what am I going to do? And you have to find the right media, the right reporters, the right editors. You can't just say, I'm just going to just send out a blast and hope for the best. It's like, you got to curate it. It takes time, and reporters are jumping ship from one publication and going to the next. And so, there are a lot of media databases available, that you can subscribe to, and that will give you phone numbers and email addresses. But I'm always worried. I'm like, how do I know those are still active and relevant? So I'm actually going to the publications, looking at the stories that kind of align with the story that I'm pitching and seeing who's writing it. And then I'm kind of, reverse engineering. It's like, okay, well, how do I get in touch with these people? Well, there's no phone number at the end of this Wall Street Journal story for this particular reporter. Maybe I know them just because I work there and I've got some contacts there and friends that still work there. But again, I want to do the diligence so that I can find it on my own without having to even bother a friend right away. So a lot of reporters now will include contact information in their Twitter handle, and you'll find like an email address, or you might even get lucky and find a phone number. But I find that the easiest way to pitch is to find that email address for the appropriate reporter, and then send them like maybe 2 to 5 sentences in an email. And in the subject line, I like using the 2 words story idea, and then a little snippet, a little headline. And then once you send it, you hope that they read it. And sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. And if you can be aggressive and you have a phone number and you really believe in that story, then I say, pick up the phone and call them and say, hey, did you get my email? I have this story. No. That never hurts. They don't have to pick up their phone. If they pick up their phone, they're obviously receptive to talking to someone they haven't talked to before, or maybe they recognize your number. So those are kind of like some ways that I go about in getting stories in publications, and some are easier than others. Trade publications generally are a little easier just because they want to be first to an industry story.
Mm.
So they might be more receptive to that. And then if it's a trend piece in that it has bigger, broader implications for the economy or, a particular initiative or whatever, then, you can start looking at more like mainstream publications like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times, maybe even, or even like your local, like, whatever your local, big publication is or media outlet is. Those are times to then kind of start looking at those places.
So you craft your story. You then start putting together a perspective map of publishers, like you said, tier one, more premium, all the way down to local. I imagine podcasts, and I've seen different
Absolutely.
types of pitch events. Yep, and I love how you're specialized in this trade publications. You're able to kind of know the lay of the land for what's what, what's where. Are there any, not for shortcut purposes, but just for some initial traction, are there any earlier, easier wins? I know there's platforms like Help a Reporter Out, Haro, where reporters or journalists are saying, "Hey, I want this type of information. I want this firsthand story." Uh, I know there's press releases and it gets into syndication. I don't think that moves the needle too much, but at the same time, gets something else to add to the list of where you were featured at any given time. Uh, I know there's some paid placements and some different things like that available. I've never looked at that as best practices. Then I know in industries like cryptocurrency and various types of fintech, it's a standard. So, where are some different entry points for a group that wants to be able to show something? Maybe they're not hearing back from some of the key journalists. I would actually invite them to go back and revision the story, talk to individuals like yourself, companies like your own, where you're able to enhance it and take it to the next level. But is there any low hanging fruit? Is there any place to start?
I think content creation is where you start. If well, let's just say that like there's only so much media out there, again, that can write a story and have the time to listen. And yet we can be in control of our own narratives through our websites and blogs and all these different places. So I don't think we should underestimate the power of that and think that just because you get published in a major publication, it's going to be that much more valuable. If you're consistent with the quality of content and storytelling that you're putting out on your own channels, I actually think that's going to be just as beneficial. Like if you were silent on your channels, but you had like a slam dunk page one story in the Wall Street Journal, I'm not even sure if, I mean, people would see the story, but then they go to your website to find out more about you. And if you were just radio silent, then what good is that? So I think that you need to be approaching this stuff with a lot of different tactics, and I'm not opposed to paid for, because when you read a paid for story, it says sponsored, right? People know that they're reading it. I think if we're talking about ethics, when paid for stories are written and there's nothing that kind of qualifies how the story got published, I think that's where you get into like some ethical dilemmas, in my opinion. If you're looking for like the pure journalism that we seek for credibility's sake, right? Um, I think that you can publish articles on LinkedIn, which is low hanging fruit. I mean, that's you publish your own article, right? But I feel like if the other, we talked about, you mentioned briefly putting something out on a wire like Business Wire or PR Newswire. I actually think that those are great ways to essentially aggregate your message.
Mm.
And there are going to be times when, I mean, those those wire services have relationships with almost every single media outlet, and they are sending those press releases to every major media outlet, and those media outlets are actually publishing the press releases on their websites. They're publishing them as the press release, and it might not get the same billing as like a real news story, but there's still SEO benefit to putting those stories out on the wire. When someone Googles your company's name, it's going to come up. And again, you're controlling the narrative there. So it's all the words that you wrote, and it's attached to social media, and it's attached to all these different things. So like, I mean, I can't, you tell me any investor that is looking at investing in a company and they're not reading the press releases, right? You're not only just going to look for the Wall Street Journal stories, but you're going to read all their press releases. So assuming you're doing a good job writing those press releases, again, telling a good story and giving stuff that is actual, results driven, kind of tangible material, not just kind of hyperbole, I think that's also going to be beneficial. So you kind of have to just like weigh, what should be prioritized at this time. One last thing I will say is that if you've got a real barn burner of a story, like you're merging with a major drug manufacturer, one way to kind of make it really almost, again, irresistible to a reporter is to offer them something called an exclusive. And an exclusive is where you're saying, hey, Mrs. Reporter, I'm going to only tell you this story because I like our relationship, and I want to give you something, a feather in your cap. And so I'm going to give it to you. I'm not going to give it to anyone else, and you can break it. And that has been, it gives the reporter something, they feel good about it because they're breaking the story. It's not going to be anywhere else. And then all the other news outlets are going to have to follow them if it's really big. But for you, it's also like kind of a way to secure media coverage of a particular story, and actually have something published. And then once it's published, like you could time it. So it's like, okay, I'm going to give you the exclusive, but it's embargoed. This is all like PR speak. It's embargoed till 7 a.m. Pacific time tomorrow. Okay. So that means that at 7 a.m. Pacific time tomorrow, I'm also going to put out the press release, and then anyone can have that story, but that's when it's embargoed till. Now, there are rules like Reg FD disclosure rules with respect to this for publicly traded companies and probably Reg A plus companies. So you have to be careful. You have to be careful in terms of the timing of when that news gets out there, so that you're creating a fair marketplace, so that if people want to trade on the news, then it's disseminated in a fair manner. But that's one way to kind of sweeten the opportunity to write a story about your company.
Make it even more irresistible with that
That's
exclusive.
Right. Yeah.
And then embargoed, that's actually a new term for me, but embargoed till this time, have at
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Strategic.
Yeah.
I
We're
like
not gonna let you we're not, you can have the exclusive up until 7 a.m. tomorrow. It's embargoed till 7 a.m. tomorrow. And then it's anyone's story, man. Like, just, good luck. Because at 7 a.m., like, the floodgates are coming down.
You have a
And
small
everyone's
window.
gonna be writing about it.
Hop on it.
Yeah. So, it's like a little pressure to say, hey, dude, get off the dime here.
Yeah. Yeah. Good way to create immediacy there. Well, Evan,
Yeah, it's
I'm
good
writing
though. I
down
mean,
so many tips here, writing so many ideas. Thought we could package a few for the audience a bit further. I know we've already got into this a little bit, but maybe just to speed round around it, maybe just to clarify a few actionables for founders. Let's say they're planning a Reg CF, a Reg A plus, Reg D, any type of campaign, Reg D 506C that they're looking to promote publicly online. They want to put together the story. They want to have a good PR program leading into their IR. Is there anything they should test out? I know we talked about putting the story together, using press releases, being able to go after some different publishers, and of course, use words like the exclusive. What else could they test out?
They need to test out how the story that they're telling is resonating with audiences prior to launch. Okay. And I would say, look, whether it's your mother-in-law, whether it's someone like myself or you, Jason, you have to pick like 5 people that aren't experts and are maybe outside of the company, are kind of objective folks, right? and you need to test out telling your story. I mean, uh, people call it an elevator pitch. Well, fine, yes, but what's the investor thesis if you're doing a Reg A or CF? Give me that investor thesis and make it sing, and make it something that you can spoon feed to, your father-in-law, who only follows the Philadelphia Eagles and knows all their stats. Like, that's kind of like, I think that's you need to, that's how I would test how the story's landing and how people are digesting it. And then ask them specific questions like, okay, what do we do? How do we make money? When are we doing it? Where are we doing it? Going back to those when, where, why, what, and how kind of, that's my test.
So run it to an audience. I think you're saying Eagles fans, but an audience that's not reading investment opportunities regularly. Go through that stress test, go through the 4 Ws and an H, see if it's resonating, see if they're able to respond back.
Correct.
Now,
Yes.
what about when that occurs? The story's to a good point. You're shopping it around. Maybe it's getting covered, maybe it's not, but you want to optimize. You want to be able to refine what you're doing, and even in one way, shape, or form, get more coverage, whether you're getting it, whether you're not. How do you go about optimizing once you're through a few rounds of this?
So having relationships with media is really key to getting your stories out there and published. And one way to do that is, even before you have like a very hot story for a reporter, sometimes what they do is, they like to do these, they're called, background meetings. It's more jargon for you, Jason. And a backgrounder, even, if you really want to get jargony. And that's an opportunity to kind of have a virtual coffee, have an in-person coffee with a reporter, and just say, hey, I'm here, this is what I'm doing, I'd love to be a resource, and establish that relationship. Again, CEOs are running around, they're doing so much stuff. So coordinating this stuff, I think you need some help. You need someone to say, hey, I'm going to reach out to the Journal, I'm going to reach out to Cheddar, I'm going to reach out to MarketWatch, and I'm going to do this like virtual road show, or we're going to be in San Francisco. Great, let's meet with this reporter from Mashable, or and actually set that up and have that in your schedule when you're going there to meet other people, so you have that relationship. And then once you have this relationship, it's like, you got a great story, tee it up, give them a call, send them an email, and they're that much more likely to write about what you're doing. So that's one way to scale.
Love it. I'm gonna have to put a terminology sheet with this episode, but to break it all down for everybody, and I'm gonna have my team start referencing this. What about a background? Can we set up a backgrounder, some type of background meeting?
Yeah, there you go.
I'm learning so much. And what about scale? So, you're setting up the backgrounders, they're working.
Yeah.
You have publishers putting stuff out before the embargo. You're making irresistible types of storylines, and exclusives are going out. It's all happening. How do you take it to the next level? I know how to do it with advertising, but how can you really build off that momentum? Maybe this is a success story you can share. Anything around tips for scale?
Yeah, I mean, I think doing these things kind of sets you up to scale, in that you have now an audience, right? And so assuming the story's good, and the audience wants to write about you, once they start writing about you, it kind of is a self-fulfilling prophecy, right, in terms of scaling coverage. But I also think that, and it's interesting because it's like, in PR, it's how do you kind of measure the value of a story in the Wall Street Journal? Like, in the advertising world, it's like, okay, it's going to cost X dollars to get in this space, and then we'll just track how much business we get from that space, right? It's not as easy to do that and track how much business you're getting from a story published in the Wall Street Journal, right? And so this is, I think, a struggle for a lot of PR folks. It's like, how do you measure that value? Well, if you took out an ad in the same publication, how much would that cost versus how much is it? And you're getting this for like, and how much of the, it's like, it's very hard to kind of figure that out. But what I will say is, if you're doing it consistently and you're meeting with media and you're putting out press releases and you're posting on LinkedIn and you're posting on Twitter, and it's all coalescing and the message is consistent and there's news and all of these elements, you will scale. That message will snowball. And I've seen it work for multiple clients. I'm engaged right now with an executive that has a revenue growth and customer success consultancy. And he's like, I want to be a thought leader. I want people to know what I do. And he's an amazing professional, amazing person. And I said, okay, well, is there any news? What's news? Right. And he's like, well, I'm working on this. I'm working on that. Like, we need some news. We need some news. So what we did was we actually created a survey that was relevant to his industry and what he does. And we actually hired a survey company, and we went out and we said, okay, what do Americans think about like digital subscription services like Netflix and Spotify, and with everything that was going on with like Rogan and Spotify and, cancel culture and, and subscriptions being down at some of these places. Like, why are Americans canceling digital subscriptions in 2022? Right? What is behind that? So we polled people. We said, what's going on? And I'm like, we're going to get back a statistic that we can then use as news, and we're going to brand the survey as well. Okay. So that it's yours and you take ownership of it, and people are going to now look to you as the expert on what we just put out there, that data. And so we did it. We came out with the first digital consumer sentiment survey last month, and we got an exclusive in .la, and it got picked up other places, and he became kind of the expert source for this, and he is an expert source for this. But we created legitimate news in order for him to get exposure, and it's those kinds of tactics that I think, and I mean, the story's got to be there, of course, but that to me is what really will help you scale and get that kind of that message and exposure that you want. And you can only control it so much. So, be careful. Like we talked about Wikipedia, right? And like people want Wikipedia
Yes.
pages. They're like, oh, I want that Wikipedia page, because then if someone sees that I have a Wikipedia page, it's going to look like I'm well known and I know, and I'm a high profile person and all this stuff. And it's like you hire these people, like, be forewarned, you do not have control of your Wikipedia page once it's out there, right? So if you have anything, so and so creating it, do you really want to create this, or do you really want to create like a really good profile on the channels that you own, so that people know who you are on your terms versus someone else's terms? So just a cautionary tale. I digressed a little bit, but anyway, I'm going to stop there for now.
It was actually a fascinating world for me when you were talking about Wikipedia publishing, integrity, guidelines that you are not supposed to self-publish. It's supposed to be its own organic thing that enters the world. I like how you're painting both sides of it, that you could have things showing up there you don't want to and have no ability to take it down. That is not your page. It's the audience, it's their page. So I actually learned a lot from it. And talking about scale here, that definitely shows a good roadmap and how to take things to the next level, demystifies it for audiences, I believe.
Yeah. I think, I mean, there's definitely other ways to scale. But again, the scale is going to come from the story that you're telling. And so if you're telling a good story and you've got someone that's helping you tell that story and craft it, then you should be able to scale. Now, investor relations is a little different sometimes, because when you're talking about scaling, it's like, well, does that mean everyone's going to be buying your stock, or it's a little different, right? Because the value that you're creating, the storytelling should create a commensurate value, like in the audience and your stock price. Like there should be some um, some, I was going to call it equity, but that's a little confusing. If you're making a lot of money and you're generating a lot of revenue and your profits are up and all these things are up, but your stock's down and the enterprise value is like far greater than where your stock's trading, there may be something wrong with your storytelling, right?
Yeah.
So how do you do that? How do you connect the dots there? And again, it comes down to telling a good story and communicating what matters. And people might be missing out on a key element of your story. Maybe it's your profit margins. Maybe it's, your ability to expand globally. Who knows what it is? But that's also an important thing to consider when you're trying to scale. It's a company that has equity out there, whether accredited, individual, public markets, institutions. You got to make sure that the story you're telling is indicative and kind of reflects the value of the company in the public eye from the capital markets perspective.
Yeah.
It's a whole other,
And
maybe, I mean, I don't want to go
it's a
too
whole
deep
nother
there, but
discussion. I have
it's all
10 more
similar. Yeah.
questions to follow there. But I
Well,
think for
yeah.
scale, it's all about how to take it to the next level from marketing to produce the same
Yeah.
results, but at scale. That the same, hey, we did one article, this is what it produced. We did two, this is what it did. We did in this window of time. I know I put out articles of different publishers, my Forbes articles as an example. Some get far more views than others. And when I try to get an understanding why, I'll see how many links have been produced from the article, how many people have talked about it on Twitter or another social platform or blog, and I'll see it repurposed, and it starts becoming very clear. So I know how much it gets picked up. I was taught that about content marketing early on too, the designing content for the purpose of social sharing and high authority links, high authority coverage from other publishers, social pages. So being able to take that to the next level. I love how you pointed out the financial markets side of it, and what is it actually producing? What does that mean for this? How is it all being gauged? You got to have the right measurements, the right ruler on both sides to be putting those analyses together as well. And Evan, we've gone through so much information here. Want to start winding it down. Thought I'd ask, if you have any final thoughts, final topics, final messages that you want to leave listeners with.
Yeah, I think that, you can't underestimate the importance of delivering a message, right? And the cliche, don't shoot the messenger. Well, you should hold messengers accountable, really, because they are
That could be the title of the
they
episode.
are yeah, they are representing you and your brand. And so if you're not putting your best foot forward when you're introducing yourself to some of these key outlets or key stakeholders, then what's the point of telling your story, right? But you also have to make sure that what you're telling, the story you're telling, is worthwhile. And I think this is where it'll be really interesting to see where AI goes as far as storytelling. You hear about the bureaus of like Reuters or Bloomberg going almost all AI, right? And reporting becoming more of an AI task. And I think that there's something that is going to be very challenging. And AI will get better, but we're human beings, right? And we know how to communicate best with other human beings. And so when you're telling your best friend a story, you kind of know when they're like, what's going to click, right? You kind of know what they're going to be interested in. And I think you got to have to apply the same instinct when you're telling your company story. You're telling it to people that you care about. They're investing money, right? And emotion and whatever it is. So make sure that the story you're telling is compelling and credible and has a foundation. So I think that's the essence of what I'd want to advise or tell people that are listening to this podcast.
AI is coming. Other avenues will be putting out content. Make sure it's credible. Make sure it's authentic. Make sure it's resonating with the audience to the best degree, and it will get the strongest absorption and distribution from there.
Yeah, I'm not an avatar, by the way. I think that's going to be one of those things where, like, if you say you're not an avatar, then you're definitely an avatar. But like, but the metaverse, the storytelling is something I think is still going to be very, very driven by human beings. And so how do you connect? What's going to trigger that interest to be like, oh, tell me more. I want to know more, and we know how to do that. We're great communicators. We're still really good. People are still really good. I don't know, maybe it's an age thing, but like even just talking on the phone without any video, right? And that's because we're like, our brains are wired so that we kind of think, we take audio and we interpret it and we create images in our heads about whatever we're hearing. So use that strength to tell a very compelling and interesting story. You got one shot.
It's so interesting to me that you bring that up. And the one shot, tell it compelling. Don't just have an avatar set up for you in a metaverse that's doing automations again and again. Be real. It will land.
Yeah.
Well, excellent, Evan. I can't thank you enough for joining. Really enjoying this discussion. Have more conversation points. Maybe we could have you on again sometime soon.
Happy to.
If anyone's listening in and saying, "Wow, we need to get in touch with Evan. I want to talk to Triunfo Partners," what is the best way for them to get hold of you?
Yeah, just feel free to email me, Pondel, P as in Paul, O, N as in Nancy, D as in David, E, L as in Larry, at Triunfo, and that's TRIU, N as in Nancy, F as in Frank, O, triumphopartners.com, epondel, triumphopartners.com. Shoot me an email. Happy to chat anytime.
Awesome. And invite all listeners to do that. Evan Pondel, thank you for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Want to thank all listeners as well. We'll see you next time. Take care.
Yeah. Thanks, Jason.